Good morning, everyone. I want to join the previous speakers in thanking the university and particularly Professor Angone for the invitation. It's wonderful to be here in this beautiful city on a beautiful day. And to talk about a really interesting and exciting topic. Now, the goal of my talk is to basically set the scene to talk about the Covenant of Mayors as an example of modern transnational environmental regulation emanating from a non-traditional regulator. Let me start by saying that I think it's a phenomenal time now to be an environmental lawyer. I'm not quite sure if it's such a phenomenal time to be an environmentalist, but definitely to be an environmental lawyer is very exciting now because the expectations for what environmental law and regulation are supposed to deliver to society have never been greater. And nowhere is that more evident as in the field of climate change and climate change control. But of course, the flip side of that is that with great expectations come serious responsibilities, and environmental law faces a number of really unprecedented pressures to deliver to society. We've got basically, for example, in climate change, we have a global problem, but a problem that has a very uneven distribution, which creates collective action problems on an epic scale across the world. In managing this issue, we have to contend with a really maddening cocktail of both urgency and uncertainty. And also, we must legislate and regulate for change. It's not enough anymore for environmental law and regulation to kind of steer and sort of chisel at the fringes of society. There's a stronger need for fundamental social change. And these are functions that law and traditional national law and even international law isn't very good at. It's not very, law is great at stabilizing relationships. It's not so good at fostering change. So we're facing this, what you call this multi-headed hydra of scale, urgency, depth, and uncertainty. And what we're experiencing at the moment, and this is why I think it's a phenomenal time to be active in this field, is that this still relatively young field of environmental law is in the process of rethinking, reconceptualizing itself in order to be able to engage with these enormous challenges. Now this, of course, this causes a lot of discontent, tensions, frustrations, but we're also seeing a lot of creativity, a lot of innovation going on. So where conventional roads, conventional answers no longer resonate, new paths are being paved, new roads are being traveled. Now, in environmental law, there's this burgeoning notion, the word has already, to my great delight, been uttered a few times here. There's this burgeoning notion of transnational environmental law, and it's becoming quite a shorthand to kind of capture this notion of law that confronts these kind of new challenges that tend to erode the impact of both sort of conventional national and international law. And really what transnational law is about for me is that it's law that engages with boundaries. It's law at the boundaries. And boundaries has a range of different meanings here. We're talking, first of all, about, of course, physical borders between different jurisdictions, and that transnational law has to sort of position itself between and over those boundaries. But also it has to confront other metaphysical frontiers, like the frontiers of science, overcoming the public and private divide that is traditionally held within both common and civil law systems, and also the boundary between law and non-legal approaches towards social development, so the law and governance boundary. And I think that the Covenant of Mayors is a wonderful example of this kind of innovative response to the multiple challenges of contemporary environmental governance, which creates and engages with law at the boundaries. Now, what is the Covenant of Mayors? And many experts will talk about this today, and they will give you far more detail and insight than I'm preparing to be here. But if you just have a quick first glance at it, for example, just looking at the official website, it defines itself as a mainstream European movement involving local and regional authorities voluntarily committing to increasing energy efficiency and use of renewable energy sources on their territories. Now, the signatories are, of course, towns and cities. They widely ranging in size and scope, and they aim to meet and exceed a 20% reduction by 2020. So it's one of those interpretations of 2020 by 2020. Now, towns and cities, so clear, we're talking about a local initiative here, but already if you look at the website, see, it's an EU-hosted website. It's com.eu, I think, and it's already quite a giveaway, and indeed, this is a Commission initiative, basically. The Covenant was a brainchild of the European Commission, which sees this as an add-on, an extension of its climate and energy package. Now, what do you need to join the Covenant, should you be considering that? Well, it helps if you're a town or a city. That's a first step. Then there are certain expectations, like you have to establish a baseline emission inventory. And there's a recommended baseline of 1990, but it's not a compulsory baseline, interestingly. And you also have to create and submit something called a SEAP, a Strategic Energy Action Plan, within 1 year of accession. And after that, when you've sort of submitted your action plan, you're supposed to regularly report on implementation of your action plan. And now, well, why would you do this as a town or city? Well, you probably already have a number of climate change obligations anyway. And in exchange for this accession, you do get tapped into quite a broad network of support. For example, and this is a wide-ranging form of support. Through the Covenant of Mayors, you get access to expertise, to administrative support, logistics support, and also to financing. And interestingly, this support emanates from a broad range of different governmental levels, from the local level, the municipal level, the national level, the supranational level, and also from the private sector. I think we're going to have later on today, we're going to have a talk by a representative from Cariplo, which is a private organization which funds a great deal of COM activity in Italy. So it's a kind of public, private, local, supranational entity. Now that much is clear. Now, for the interest of my talk, the germane question is, okay, but is this a regulatory regime? Does this have anything to do with environmental regulation at all? As well, we're calling this self-definition that the Covenant gives itself. It calls itself a movement. A movement is, wonderful, quite sort of vague word. It doesn't really sort of connote regulation straight away. And also, of course, well, when we're sort of thinking back to our traditional notions of regulation, what are regulators? What are regulatory authorities? Well, our archetypes of regulatory authorities tend to be state-based, and we think about public authorities that have been bestowed with a particular public mandate by the state, and that have also typically been given special competencies in order to fulfill that mandate. That mandate will typically have to do something with either correcting market failure or pursuing public interest goals. And they will be operating under the supervision, if you like, of administrative law. So thinking of that and then looking at the Covenant of Mayors, they seem worlds removed, obviously. But then, of course, we do know, and especially those of us who have an interest in the European Union, we do know that that sort of archetype of state-based regulation, that doesn't exhaust what regulation is all about, that this does not exhaust the concept of the regulator. Undeniably, in the EU we have EU regulators. Very often the Commission will act as a regulator. We know that. Not always the Commission, but often. And it's not a state-based body. And also its links with the sort of overarching structure of administrative law are a little bit weaker, a little bit thinner than they are at the national level. So we clearly have regulators there that do not correspond to this archetype. And this, I think, intellectually has been one of the great blessings of the European Union. It's that it sort of confronted us very much with the sort of rigidity of our former thinking about regulation. And it's really confronted us with the fact that, well, you know, there's a lot of regulation beyond the state. We shouldn't be so tied up to our notion about particular institutions. It's not always a state-based public authority that is a regulator. And not only is there regulation beyond the state, no, not only have we sort of, has this awareness of the EU allowed us to kind of denationalize our concept of regulation a bit. It's also allowed us to decenter it somewhat, because if we, for example, if we look at the European Commission and we say, okay, well, that's a regulator too, so boom, you have one more regulator. But we quickly appreciate that looking at the Commission, just to give an example, as the regulator, that it doesn't really fully reflect how the Commission works as a regulator, that looking at the regulator as a sort of monolithical, undifferentiated block is rather inadequate, that we are overlooking the kind of the interchange and the connections between the Commission's regulatory functions and the national administrations, for example, which have exchanges within a regulatory network, both in the form of, for example, committees that assist the Commission in regulating, and in the form of implementing bodies, because implementation is very often more than just straightforward bog standard application. There's more sort of regulatory interpretation that goes on there. So we've become aware that regulatory authority isn't so much something bestowed purely and absolutely on one particular actor, that it tends to be more dispersed. And when we're sort of starting to think about regulation in this way, then we see that maybe the Covenant of Mayors is coming a little bit, hovering a little bit closer into the regulatory sphere. Now, this does, of course, mean that, well, we need to have a sort of flexible, workable notion of regulation. And a lot of work has been done. Also, for example, at my institution, at the LSE, a lot of people spend a lot of time talking about, well, you know, what is a sort of workable, good definition of regulation? There are many around. One that I find very useful and instructive is just basically to look at regulation and call it a deliberative exercise of influence on a target's behavior. And this could be either for the stabilization or the modification of this behavior. And it must be performed with a certain degree of authority and a certain degree of persistence. I think these are sort of core elements of regulation, of what regulation is. Now, once we embrace this sort of more denationalized, decentered understanding of regulation, we see a whole host of regulators opening up in the regulatory landscape. We have, of course, we have national regulators, you know, the old boys, the one we were familiar with. Interestingly, though, our sort of more contemporary, our more transnational reading of regulations even sort of allows us to look at the actions of the very classical players in a different light. Like, for example, if we're having a less monolithical approach, we might construe, for example, industrial regulation, where the public authority typically depends very much on the industrial sector for information and for cooperation in the regulatory process, as more of a networked cooperative process rather than a sort of top-bottom approach. Beyond the national regulators, we have supranational regulators, and again, like the European Commission is a good example of this. And here too, we see blurring of the strict divides between what is regulatory authority and what is actually the reception on the part of the regulated body. And we see, of course, also that more sort of networked structures developing between the EU and the member states. And now, of course, well, why stop with public authority? Once you think of regulation as a deliberate exercise of influence done with a certain authority and done with a certain degree of persistence, well, you don't necessarily need to be a public body in order to exercise that influence. And so it opens up an awful lot of private activity to the purview of regulation. A broad definition of regulation doesn't exclude private actors. And there are clearly already a number of groups that are officially private bodies that have been, that are considered to exercise regulatory authority. For example, in EU law, there are certain obligations imposed on sporting associations that are typically associated with bodies that exercise regulatory authority. Deontological professional groups, like the orders of lawyers, orders of medicines, are typically considered to exercise regulatory authority. If that's one end of the spectrum, on the other end of the spectrum, there are a number of groups and associations of whom you could say, well, they are trying to kind of exercise influence on behavior, and they're doing this in quite a persistent way, that we still consider very much outside of the realm of regulation. An example could be the Freemasons, for example. Freemasons typically, so they're not considered regulators, even though there is this sort of desire to exercise influence, but they're considered non-regulatory groups, and that also means that particular expectations that we have of how regulatory authorities behave are not imposed on them. Like, for example, in Belgium, there are still a lot of Freemasons chapters that do not allow women in their groups. If this were a public body, that would be massively problematic. But they're still allowed to do that because it's considered still really a private group. And if you want to know how happy I am about that, I will be very pleased to talk to you about that at length during the break. But what's interesting is, of course, well, between these sort of private bodies that we now very often think of as regulatory and those that we clearly do not think of as regulatory, there's this big gray zone in between. And particularly a lot of those bodies that have environmental interests seem to fall within this gray zone between private regulation and non-regulatory activity, like CSR, corporate social responsibility commitments, private standard setters, private certifiers, members of, for example, packaging and waste covenants, etc. So there were this host of movements, of groups, associations that are situated somewhere between regulation and non-regulation. Now, so it's still very much in dispute whether or not we should look at the activities of these kind of groups, such as private standard setters, such as, say, for example, the Forest Stewardship Council, as regulatory. But it's quite important to have this debate, and it's quite important to consider this. One sort of convention that is developing is that, well, there's clearly not a sort of singular attribute that bestows regulatory quality. Regulatory authority seems to be the product of a composite of attributes, all of which are desirable, but none of which can really be considered either fully necessary or fully sufficient. And here's a list. Whoop. Hang on, I've gone too far. I'll tell you what the list is. The list clearly didn't make it onto the slide, but it does exist in my head. So there is a range of regulatory attributes that we can look at in order to kind of make these determinations. And the key is to weight the attribution to make composite assessments, such as the authorship, which is, you know, which body does it emanate from, but also the function. How does the communication work? Is it facilitating, managerial? Is it coercive? Does it lead by example? What's the objective? What kind of goal is influence exercised? Is this a public goal or a very private goal? What's the impact? To what extent is it effective? To what extent does this exercise of influence actually succeed in either consolidating or changing behavior? What degree of externality is there? In other words, to what extent are groups or entities that are not part of the inner circle affected by the activities of the inner circle? What kind of instruments are being used? Is it a standard setting approach? Is it a social communication? Is it benchmarking? So there are different sort of attributes to look at that can help us in this sort of determination as to whether these actors in the gray zone should be considered as exercising regulatory authority or not. Now, why, other than a sort of, beyond it being a quite cool intellectual exercise, why is it important to ask this question of, is what we are experiencing here, is what we are witnessing here regulation or not? What's the point of going through this exercise? Well, the key point is, of course, that once you label something as regulation, that you get a number of connotations of expectations of particular quality, that regulation is going to meet particular quality expectations. And there are different interpretations of that. But for example, the UK Task Force on Better Regulation has identified what it deems 5 qualities of good regulation: that it should be proportionate, that it should be accountable, consistent, transparent, and targeted. 5 qualities. So once you call something regulation, you're going to, you sort of, once you label a particular activity as regulatory, it means that you can start looking at them and seeing, well, does it have a number of qualities? That means that you can engage with, ask questions about the legitimacy of the exercise of authority. And not just the legitimacy, but a number of these qualities, such as proportionality, are not just legitimacy expectations, but also legality expectations. An exercise of regulatory authority that is disproportionate can breach legal standards. So for these reasons, knowing whether to qualify a particular group as a regulator and particular activities as regulatory activities is essential indeed. And so what we've seen is that clearly, this is the case for national regulators. It's also pretty uncontroversial by now that there are a number of supranational actors as regulators. There are a range of private regulators that already are considered to have to meet these kind of standards, and more are in the gray zone, and the discussion is going on about the extent to which, for example, an entity such as ICANN has to live up to transparency expectations. And now into this already quite complex and witch's cauldron come these new types of regulatory structures, such as the Covenant of Mayors, which you could call almost like hybrid regulators, because you've got public bodies, but they are not exercising their influence in the traditional way. They're not exercising their influence through the use of legal instruments in this case. So that's incidentally, but there are, of course, the Covenant of Mayors is one example. There are a range of these kind of hybrid regulators developing. I found some data about other groups such as Climate Alliance, Énergicité, Cities for Climate Protection. And they're typically thought of as transnational quasi-regulatory networks. And a British social scientist, Harriet Bulkley, has looked quite a bit at how these groups function, and she calls them networks of pioneers, or by pioneers for pioneers. And let's unpack the covenant a little bit as a sort of as a regulator. Let's look at the Commission. Does the Commission actually function as a regulator in the Covenant? Well, on the one hand, well, it clearly it doesn't impose rules. It doesn't impose behavior on others. It's voluntary. You can exceed. The Commission is not holding a gun to any city's head to become a member of it. Also, its activities in this area are very much voluntary, facilitating. It's a facilitating function that it exercises. And there's a great deal of flexibility allowed in implementation. But then on the other hand, we do have to take into account that we have quite a binding context there, because there is this 20% reduction commitment, which is a legally binding norm in the background. And the Commission sees this as part of its climate and energy change package. And if you look at it from the point of view of the towns and cities, which you could sort of say are the addressees of the Covenant that have to implement the standards set by the Covenant, yes, it's voluntary. Yes, it's sort of supposed to exceed their minimal obligations. But again, these cities, these towns also do have typically a public mandate for climate change protection. They have different legal obligations, and it's very difficult to disentangle the sort of the required from the voluntary in this area. And this makes for basically a sort of, what we see here is quite a substantial reconfiguration of institutions, institutional dynamics, legal and regulatory obligations, which raises a host of new questions. For example, if it's not really appropriate to think of these commitments as purely voluntary because they engage with surrounding legal expectations for climate change action, then how does that affect, for example, what the Commission can do in case of a city's underperformance? How does this affect what other mayors can do if they see that certain members of the Covenant are slacking? How does this affect the kind of expectations that the public can have vis-a-vis cities and towns that have signed up to the Covenant? These are important questions to ask. And the regulatory nature, or the quasi-regulatory nature of the Covenant will play a role in answering these kind of questions. Now, coming back to sort of my original title of The More the Merrier with a question mark, and in conclusion, I just wanted to give a sort of little preliminary assessment of, is it really the more the merrier? Is it good to have these kind of new initiatives cropping up? Well, from an academic point of view, I of course say, yes, you know, this is fascinating. You know, look at what wonderful legal problems this creates. So yes, the more the merrier for me. But beyond that, probably, well, first of all, I do think we have to be aware of certain risks that this creates. And it's already been raised by a number of speakers here. There are risks of uncertainty of legal status and of intransparency. We also have to be aware of to what extent do these kind of actions complement mandatory action or actually displace it? And particularly since a lot of mandatory action in the area of climate change is formulated in terms of a kind of an obligation of effort rather than an obligation to undertake specific action. So there's quite a scope for displacement. We also have to ask the question, to what extent does a sort of self-mobilization of local actors dilute the formal public commitment? To what extent will it sort of allow national governments to take a back seat and to say, well, you know, climate change, that's a local issue. You know, that's not our thing. And then there's also, of course, a question of unevenness. There's a great variation in implementation. If you look at, for example, if you look at the SEAPs of London and one other one I've looked at, Redcar and Cleveland. SEAP of London, you know, it's a brochure about 170 pages long. London is committing to 38% reduction, up to 65% reduction by 2025. It's a big enterprise, a big picture of Boris on the front cover and everything. And then you look at the SEAP of Redcar and Cleveland, which is also a member of the Covenant of Mayors. And it's about 7 lines long. They're committing to 20%, and they have assigned a 50% officer to work on this issue. So it's massively uneven, and the question is like, well, to what extent does this kind of affect, for example, our expectations of consistency that we have of regulation as one of the regulatory qualities? But beyond these problems, though, I do think that overall it's very promising, and for my last minute, I'll just go over the reasons why I think that by and large, it's more promising than risky, in that we know that, for example, in climate change, there are no silver bullets. You've got to have you have to attack from multiple angles, and this is we need a groundswell of different initiatives in order to make a dent in the issue. What I very much like about it is that it reorganizes relationship between the local and the supranational level in a less hierarchical way, which is something that's probably a lot more acceptable for the European citizen than the typical sort of primacy-dominated relationship between EU and the national level. It fosters alternative ways of regulatory communication. If you look at the CEAPs, they're very pragmatic, very hands-on, very sort of different type of giving advices as the standard regulatory guidelines. And ultimately, it enables those of us who do want to go faster, further, to still do that. It creates an interesting scope for positive differentiation. And in light of the many daunting prospects that we face, this is a scope that I don't think we can afford to just overlook. Thank you very much for your attention.